Hey, do you have to align with the EU taxonomy? In this episode, I'm going to talk to Joana from Factlines, who previously worked with the European Union and now is an absolute expert in the EU taxonomy. And we discussed topics like what is the difference between the EU taxonomy and the CSRD. So if this interests you, definitely check out this episode. Hello, Joana. And first of all, thank you so much for taking the time to be at the AtlasZero podcast. For those of the listeners that don't know you yet, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? What do you do right now? And what are the topics you're dealing with?
Sure, Daniel. And thank you so much for having me today on this podcast. So, my name is Joana. I'm currently working as a product manager for a Norwegian company called Factlines. And Factlines has been around for quite a few years. We are a scale up, and we are an ESG platform whose intention it is to make sustainability easier to understand for businesses, and also to make it easier for businesses to act upon things that they might need to change in order to become more sustainable.
Okay, super interesting. And how did you get into this position? Did you do anything with sustainability before, or where did the interest come from?
Yeah, that's a pretty good question. So when I applied to join Factlines, I applied to become a product manager specifically for an upcoming product on EU taxonomy. And the reason
Mhm.
I applied at the time was because living in Norway, you don't see that many opportunities to work in product and at the same time working with something that is connected to EU affairs. And
Mhm.
product management is my third career, but as soon as I finished university, I actually started working for the EU. And that's what I did for a number of
Nice.
years. So I thought it was a unique opportunity to capitalize on that knowledge and experience that I had had.
Okay. And in your time with the EU, did you already work on sustainability topics? Because I feel like the EU taxonomy in general is not the easiest topic to like choose from when you
Mhm.
see all the different topics there.
Yes. Oftentimes people ask me, isn't it terribly difficult to understand all the details and intricacies of EU taxonomy? And my answer tends to be, I was working there as a conference interpreter. Um,
Mhm.
so in that capacity, I would attend meetings on any given topic. And I can assure you, there are topics at EU level that are much more complicated than EU taxonomy. At least EU
Mhm.
taxonomy is structured. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Then I'm glad that we today only will talk about EU taxonomy and don't go into any topics that are more complicated. And in regards to fact lines, how do you work with EU taxonomy right now? So what is the approach that the company takes on this certain issue?
Hmm. Um, so when I joined Factlines, as mentioned, there had already been a decision that this is a product that we're going to build. So the
Hmm.
next question became, okay, so how exactly do we propose to do that? And there is any number of ways. I'm sure you've had previous guests on this podcast talking about the specific ways that their companies decided to tackle this issue. We did a lot of user research.
Hmm.
We already had, as a company, we already had a product that had users. We knew that some of the people using Factlines would also be potentially interested in taxonomy. And we also knew that oftentimes they were scared. They weren't sure what it
Hmm.
was about. They were even less sure about how to tackle this. Will this mean spending an awful lot of time and money? Do I need to hire an entire team? So on and so forth. So we tried to focus on pain points, basically.
Hmm.
And we ended up with an approach that intends to simplify EU taxonomy as much as it is feasible to do in a software product, while remaining compliant. We are, I think we can say, we are a compliance first company. So we do not want our customers to use the software and figure out, oops, actually, we're not compliant. That's not the goal. So it's
Yeah.
compliance first, but it's user friendliness second.
Okay. Yeah, I'm going to ask you a little bit more about the approach later, but maybe let's start with the topic because I talk to companies and I feel like the term EU taxonomy is not really that certain for a lot of companies. So maybe let's say I'm a company that is completely new to the whole EU European Green Deal topic. How do you explain what is EU taxonomy and what role does it play?
Mhm. So the EU taxonomy regulation for economically sustainable activities, which is the law name of the thing, is a legally binding document that applies to companies that fall under its scope and not just non-financial companies or non-financial undertakings. Sorry, there might be a bit of jargon coming into this podcast, but that's how it is. So it applies at large to financial market participants, whether those are companies or investment funds or insurance companies or even something else. So that's the broad stroke. Then you have more specific aspects to the scope. You might be in scope if you are a larger company, if you're listed, and the scope of this regulation itself, it's also a moving target because the regulation started off by being applicable to really large companies, and we know that over the years it will progressively apply to smaller and smaller companies. I think we will get to the point where any company in the EU with over 5 employees have to
Hmm.
deal with it somehow.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And is the scope going to be the more or less the same as with the CSRD, or is the scope like what companies are affected a little bit different from the CSRD?
There are there are quite a few common points. Yes.
Hmm.
But the CSRD will still apply to larger companies. And so by definition, it will be applicable to fewer companies than the EU taxonomy because most companies in the EU tend to be smaller in size.
Okay. And how could one put the EU taxonomy in relation to the CSRD?
Mhm.
So, because I see some companies that are using both terms for more or less the same, and where can one draw the line? Like, what is the topic of EU taxonomy, and what is the CSRD, and how do they relate to each other?
Um, if you think about, so you as a business owner, let's say, in principle, you should be able to explain to anyone, whether it's your bank or someone on the street or someone at a party, what it is that your company does. We build
Hmm.
buildings, or we're into transport or something else. So when trying to comply with the EU taxonomy, that is pretty much the kind of exercise that you are required to do. Only
Hmm.
you have to do it within a certain framework, and that's the taxonomy itself. So the taxonomy took a very large portion of European economy, divided it into economic activities across multiple industries, multiple sectors, and then set specific sustainability criteria for each of those activities. So it can be stuff like if you are retrofitting or renovating a building and you're a construction company, if you want to be aligned, another jargon, aligned with the EU taxonomy, then you need to ensure that you're doing your renovations in a certain way, in a way that is not wasteful. If you are installing new bathrooms, you have to ensure that the taps that you've chosen are not wasting water, for example.
Hmm.
It's this sort of thing. Um, So that's one of the purposes of the taxonomy. The other purpose that tends not to be mentioned, but it's extremely important, is as a business owner, in addition to complying with environmental criteria, you also need to make sure that your company is run in a way that is socially sustainable. So we're talking about things like respecting human rights, respecting labor rights, not using slave labor, not employing children. So there's one part of the taxonomy assessment which is also about that. And then for companies that also have to comply with the CSRD, which is a completely separate piece of EU law. For the geekiest ones, you can spend time with Eurolex. So that's the official database where you can find all of these documents. The CSRD focuses really on the reports that a company has to do on an annual basis. So a lot of people know about annual reports. They probably know a lot more about the financial side of an annual report, which is where you showcase, okay, this is how much money we made, this is how much money we lost, this is where we spent it, all of that. So the CSRD wants to impose a new standard, not for financials, but for sustainability matters. And it sets out a very detailed set of rules about the topics that you have to include in your management report and how those have to be included. The ultimate goal in all of this is to create sustainability standards that are as strict as current financial standards and that make it possible for anyone to, for instance, compare management reports between two different companies, which is not something that is possible today because management reports, oftentimes they're more like marketing exercises. So fluffiness involved. If you're a company that does not want to draw attention to certain things, you just leave them out of your management report. With the CSRD, that will no longer be possible. And the last part of your question, what is the link between these two? So there is a specific set of disclosures in the CSRD where you need to include the results of your taxonomy assessment. So you have to say, okay, we did our taxonomy, we figured out we have these 3 activities, and this is our taxonomy score, basically.
Okay. So in that sense, the figuring out the taxonomy is then part of the CSRD report.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yes.
So any company that finishes the full CSRD report has to do EU taxonomy as well.
Yes. That's the very
Okay.
short answer.
And yeah, okay, good. And how do companies approach? I know you already touched on this, but I just want to like stupidly ask about this again. Like, how can companies approach the topic of finding out which are their EU taxonomy topics?
There is one point which is common to both the taxonomy and the CSRD, and that's the double materiality approach, or DMA.
Mhm.
So, as part of the Green Deal, um, all financial market participants are heavily encouraged to start reporting not just on things that are financially relevant to them, but basically everything that also creates an impact, either on the environment or from a social perspective. So that's in simple terms the double materiality approach. So whether you are now starting to do your taxonomy or your CSRD, you have to do the DMA first to understand, okay, either these are the economic activities that are the most relevant to me according to the DMA, or these are the sustainability topics that I have to include in my CSRD report. Yes.
Okay. And I know from the CSRD that there's the clear structure of the ESRS, and then you have like the 92 topics and I think 1,200 something data points that are included in that. Is there something similar for the EU taxonomy where one can say, okay, those are all the possible topics, and of course, not every company will have to like relate to any of the topics, but then you have already like a full set of lists that you know, okay, those are all the things, and now let's have a look which is actually relevant.
There is a structure in place, thankfully. Um,
Mhm.
so at the moment, you have 107 possible economic activities that you can use to do your taxonomy assessment. You can use as few or as many as required. And the process of reporting tends to be slightly similar to the one that you have for the CSRD as well. Meaning, for taxonomy, you also start with a long list of potential
Mhm.
activities. For each activity, you then have to select at least one out of six environmental objectives. Um, because you have different criteria for each of these six. And then you start with the actual technical screening. So that's figuring out, okay, are the taps in my renovation project compliant or not? Or, for instance, if you're in the transport sector, you might actually have to check, okay, where are we sourcing our electricity from?
Mhm.
Here, very wildly, the 107 economic activities cover well over 90% of the economy, especially if you look at it from
Mhm.
an emissions perspective. And they can cover anything from forests to heavy manufacturing. So the criteria will be different. The expected results will also be different. In some sectors, it's much easier to come out of it with a higher score than it is in others.
Okay. And let's say a company then goes through the 107 different topics and goes through all the process and does it like properly. What is the benefit? I almost said, like, what is the outcome? What is the advantage that companies get through this? And I know that it's partially a mandatory thing, but still, like, what is the positive outcome for companies from this?
Mm. Um, well, being compliant is obviously a thing. But the second one is easier and cheaper access to financing,
Hmm.
because the higher your taxonomy score is, and when I say taxonomy score, I'm actually simplifying, because what, for instance, your bank will ask about is, can you give me the percentage of your turnover, capex and opex, that is both illegible and aligned with taxonomy?
Hmm.
Then the bank typically has access to some benchmark data, so they will be able to tell if you are within the average for your industry or for that specific economic activity, or if your score is actually higher than the average. In which case, in theory, you would pay less if you need to um, borrow capital.
Hmm. And the score that you're talking about, is this super simplified, of course, but is this basically a percentage and then the percentage determines the score, or is basically the score?
The percentage is the basic score, yes. And we can already see that if you um, check out annual reports from listed companies in European stock exchanges. You should be able to see what their scores are each year.
Hmm. Okay. Yeah, I'm definitely going to look out for this because I think with the whole European Green Deal and the idea behind that to shift finances towards green activities, I think like the idea behind that is super good. And then it just needs to be explained in a way that companies understand and that it's actually implementable. So I really like the idea in general.
Mm.
Regarding the time frame for all of this and the EU taxonomy, can you give us a little bit more an insight into where do we stand with the EU taxonomy right now? What are maybe deadlines or next steps that are coming up?
Mhm. So the regulation has already the EU taxonomy regulation has already entered into force. So that means that the first step typically for a company is to check whether you are in scope or not. To put it very simply, if you're listed in any stock exchange in Europe, you're in scope, and if you're large enough, you will be in scope. Um, and then you have to follow up and do the required assessment. Uh, so the scope, as I mentioned, will become progressively wider. So smaller and smaller companies will have to start doing their EU taxonomy. So there are some indicative timelines, but we've also seen that the Green Deal has suffered some delays due to various factors, including the fact that it requires a lot of effort from companies to really get started and organize themselves and come up with the setup that is feasible for them. Larger companies might
Mhm.
have the resources to just hire an entire sustainability team and say, deal with this, whichever way you see fit. But that's not the case for everybody. So I think for this year, we don't foresee any major updates to the regulation. But it's quite possible that in 2025 or 2026, you will see that the thresholds for companies have been lowered. So you might end up with companies that have, I don't know, 150 full time employees and a certain turnover being in scope of taxonomy.
Okay, understood. And maybe what would be your recommendation? Let's say I'm a company that like falls into the scope and has to deal with the EU taxonomy. Like, what are complications that you see in the market with companies? Like, what are the difficulties, and what would, in general, be your recommendations for company to approach a topic and to advance on this EU taxonomy timeline?
Well, one basic recommendation, very, very basic, would be you don't have to start just because you are in scope. You can actually start before you are mandated to do it. And we have actually seen this, that some companies take a very proactive approach and they say,
Mhm.
okay, if we start doing this on a voluntary basis, then the results of our assessment don't have to be made public. And that
Mhm.
buys us time to make adjustments in case we see, okay, we might have a very low score, or there are certain aspects of the social side of taxonomy that we're not completely compliant with. Then we have more time
Mhm.
to fix those, because once it becomes a mandatory exercise, you have to disclose your results. They have to be made public. So
Mhm.
that's definitely one piece of advice, is if you can afford to, start early. If you are already in scope, please don't try to dodge it. We've also seen cases where companies decided, we're not doing this, even though it's mandatory for us, because at the moment, we don't see that there will be any repercussions for us.
Mhm.
Which is also interesting. But basically, assuming that you are in scope and have decided to do this, um, you are the best person to know how your company works. You know how big it is.
Mhm.
You know if you operate primarily with silos or not silos. You know if you can tackle most of it internally by just distributing work, or if you need external help to do it. Um, so just look at the different options. I mean, that's also part of the reason why you created AtlasZero. I'm sure it's because at the moment it might seem like there are too many options on the table. But it really boils down to you either hire people to help you, and that's primarily
Mhm.
consultants or lawyers. That's also an option.
Mhm.
Um, or you decide to do it through software, or
Yeah.
both. So
Yeah, but I totally agree with your recommendation because I see that a lot of companies, they're a little bit overwhelmed with the whole topic and the regulation, and then at the market that there are so many different options. And then they try to push off the topic or wait a little bit or really approach it in the next year. But I also see that those companies that I'm talking to that really know what they're doing and that seem to progress very good. They started it very early. They did it step by step. And now they actually get into the area where they have good results. And I feel like therefore the recommendation to start as early as possible is super crucial because the topic itself, it's not going to go away. So companies need to start with that, and whatever help they then take, yeah, it's definitely going into the right direction.
and
Mm,
if I might just add one thing, there's also the question of auditing. So
mhm.
we know that mandatory auditing for EU taxonomy will be a thing in the near future. When I say in the near future, within the next 3 to 5 years. So that's an additional reason why you want to be prepared, because usually this kind of reporting exercise, because of its complexity, usually you don't get it 100% right the first time you do it, and it's fine. But if you need to pass an audit, you better be adequately prepared for it.
Mm, yeah. Another thing that I get asked quite often by companies is whether I have some free templates or free material, because in general, like companies are struggling to comprehend everything, and there everything that they can use to just like get a better overview then helps them a lot. Do you have anything or do you know of any material that you would recommend to companies that are looking for some guidance?
For companies that are literally trying to figure out what it is that they need to comply with, we are about to launch an absolutely free of charge ESG legislation calculator, which sounds like a mouthful, but really all it is um, you can go to factlines.com and you tell us just a little bit about your company, and we will
Mhm.
tell you if you are currently in scope of EU taxonomy or CSRD or CSDDD even.
Mm,
Another
mhm.
interesting one. Yeah. So
Yeah.
that's one thing that we found would be useful. We saw that companies were spending a lot of time just trying to figure out, am I in? Am I out? Do I have to do it? Yes or no? Yeah. And
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree. This is like a lot of companies that I talk to about, they're still in a phase where they try to figure out what they have to comply with and what they need to focus on. So if you could send me the link to that, that would
Mhm.
be super nice. And I can put them into the show notes
Yeah.
and companies can access this easily because I think this would be super helpful.
Hmm.
Do you have any other ideas for like how companies can get some guidance?
Um, well, on the specific topic of auditing, which I know for many companies is a topic far in the future, but it's really coming pretty
Mhm.
quickly. We're having a webinar uh,
Mm,
in June that anyone
mhm.
can also join, and it's on June 11th at 10 a.m. It's about the different EU regulations and directives and how companies can be ready to deal with auditors.
Hmm. Super interesting. Yeah. Please send me this link as well. Then I put the two of them together and companies that are interested can just like find it directly in the show notes. I have one last question I would like to ask you. If now someone listens to the podcast and tomorrow goes into the office and has the topic of EU taxonomy, what is the one thing that they should take away from from this conversation to then talk about in the next meeting or in the next lunch break to the colleagues about?
I think it's very useful to, when we're trying to simplify EU taxonomy, to really highlight the notion that yes, it is about compliance, but ultimately it is about future-proofing your business. And
Mm-hmm.
whether that means making it easier for you to have access to capital or something else, it still amounts to, we want you to still be in business in many years' time, and you can actually use EU taxonomy to do that. So
Mm-hmm.
it's not all
Yeah.
doom and complicated stuff.
Yeah. No, I really like that argument. And I think that's a very good way to close the podcast because I completely believe in that now a lot of the topics, they are about compliance and they're mandatory and you have to do this. But I think that if companies actually approach the topic and then really use it, that this can be an actual strength for the future and like a huge opportunity.
Mm.
Okay. So that were all the questions that I had for you, Joanna. Thank you so much again for taking the time. I really appreciate it. And I hope that we can talk soon again.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure. Take care.